In the suffocating heat of a Pacific Island prison camp in 1943, a Japanese soldier stood naked before a row of metal pipes jutting from concrete walls. Steam curled upward, water hissed through the lines. His hands trembled. He had survived Guadalcanal. He'd watched friends die in naval bombardments. He'd endured starvation, disease, and the shame of surrender. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, for what the Americans called a shower. Around him, dozens of fellow prisoners clutched bars of soap, their eyes fixed on the overhead nozzles with a mixture of terror and confusion. They had been told the Americans were monsters. That capture meant torture, degradation, death. Instead, their captors were ordering them to wash, with soap, in hot water, as though cleanliness mattered more than punishment. This is the story of how something as simple as a shower shattered everything Japanese prisoners of war believed about their enemy. How pipes and soap became weapons more powerful than propaganda. And how, in the most unexpected place, defeated soldiers discovered that America's true strength wasn't just firepower. It was the abundance and organization to extend dignity even to those who had tried to kill them. The showers, at first feared as instruments of execution, became symbols of a civilization these men had fundamentally misunderstood. What began as humiliation transformed into revelation. And in that transformation lay a truth that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The enemy they'd been taught to hate had given them something their own army never could. This is the story of the paradox of captivity, where defeat led to discovery, and where hot water became a quiet weapon that changed minds more effectively than any bullet. The gates of the American POW camp swung open with a metallic screech that seemed to announce the end of one world and the beginning of another. Crafted vivid scene with tension and Helena-style details. I need to build tension and detail here, following the Helena style. Let me create the scene vividly, with specific sensory details. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners shuffled through in ragged columns, their uniforms caked with months of battle grime. The long marches from surrender points had left them exhausted, their boots splitting at the seams, their bodies covered in the dust of island roads. The tropical sun beat down mercilessly, turning sweat into sticky streams that carved paths through dirt-crusted faces. Most kept their eyes downcast. Shame hung heavy in the humid air. These men had been taught from childhood that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on family honor that could never be washed away. They had watched officers commit suicide rather than face capture. They had heard stories, terrible stories, about what happened to prisoners in American hands. Now they were living those stories, after registration, after medical checks that felt invasive and foreign, after being issued thin cotton uniforms marked with large PW stamps. They were herded toward a long wooden building. Steam rose from vents along its roof. The structure looked industrial, functional, built for a purpose none of them could quite decipher. Inside, pipes ran overhead like metal veins, each sprouting a chrome nozzle aimed downward. Drains pocked the concrete floor at regular intervals. The air smelled of chemicals, sharp, astringent, nothing like the rice straw and earth they'd known in Japanese barracks. American guards, their faces stern but not cruel, motioned with sharp gestures. Strip. Line up. Move. The prisoners hesitated. One man, a former corporal from the 38th Division, later recalled that moment with crystalline clarity. "We stood there, looking at those pipes," he would say decades later to an interviewer in Tokyo. "And we thought they were going to gas us, like what we'd heard about in Europe. We thought we were being led to execution disguised as bathing." Whispers spread through the ranks. Nervous Japanese flowed from mouth to mouth. Some clutched their few belongings tighter, as if material possessions could somehow shield them from what awaited. Others closed their eyes, perhaps praying to ancestors, perhaps simply trying to summon courage for whatever death was coming. The guards grew impatient. Orders were barked. Interpreters, Japanese Americans in U.S. military uniforms, translated in sharper tones. Shoes off, belts unbuckled, tunics removed. Reluctant fingers worked at buttons and ties. Scarred bodies emerged from tattered fabric. Battle wounds carved across chests and backs. Tropical ulcers left angry red patches on legs and arms. Ribs showed through skin pulled tight by months of inadequate rations. These were men who had been ground down by war, reduced to their most vulnerable state. They stood naked before their enemies, feeling the weight of humiliation settle onto their shoulders like a physical burden. Then the guards thrust bars of soap into their hands. The soap was pale, almost white, wrapped in thin paper stamped with English words none of them could read. It smelled strongly of lye and chemicals, nothing like the gentle rice-based soaps of home. The prisoners turned the bars over in their palms, studying them as though they might contain hidden dangers. One by one they shuffled toward the waiting nozzles, each step heavy with dread. And then the water came. The hiss started as a whisper, then built to a roar as valves opened fully. From every overhead pipe, water gushed forth in thick streams, not a trickle, not a rationed splash, but endless cascades of warm liquid that crashed onto shoulders and ran down backs in rivulets. The temperature shocked them first. Hot. Not scalding, but genuinely warm. Heated to a temperature that seemed impossible given the tropical climate. For men who had spent months, even years, bathing in cold streams or buckets of seawater, the sensation was almost overwhelming. A naval mechanic from Yokosuka, captured after his destroyer was sunk off Guadalcanal, would later describe the moment to his grandson. "I felt the warmth hit my shoulders and I froze. I actually thought, this is it. This is poison. This is how they kill us. But then I realized it was just water, just clean, hot water, and I almost wept." Around him, similar reactions rippled through the prisoners. Some stood rigid, waiting for pain that never came. Others let out involuntary gasps as the warmth soaked through months of accumulated grime. A few closed their eyes, faces tilting upward as if receiving benediction. The water kept coming, and coming, and coming. In the Imperial Japanese Army, water had been precious beyond measure. On Pacific Islands, every drop was rationed for drinking. Washing was done with whatever could be spared, usually nothing. Men had learned to ignore the constant itch of lice, the burning of infected sores, the suffocating feeling of dirt pressed into every pore. To endure filth was considered strength, a mark of a true soldier who could overcome physical discomfort through sheer will. But here, water flowed as though it were infinite. The guards shouted instructions, gesturing at the soap, demonstrating scrubbing motions. The interpreters translated, "Wash thoroughly, use the soap, all over, hair, body, feet, everything." Tentatively, prisoners began to comply. The soap foamed unexpectedly, creating thick lather that spread across skin with ease. They rubbed it over their arms, their chests, watching as dirt that had seemed permanently embedded began to lift away. The water carried away months of grime, swirling it toward the drains in gray-brown streams. Some scrubbed mechanically, still suspicious, doing the bare minimum required. Others, as the minutes passed and no hidden cruelty emerged, began to wash with something approaching relief. They worked the soap into their scalps, feeling lice eggs dissolve. They scrubbed at tropical ulcers, watching the accumulated pus and dead skin wash away. They cleaned between their toes, under their arms, places they hadn't been able to properly wash since deployment. The transformation was visible. Where moments before had stood gray, filth-covered forms now stood men whose skin showed its true color. Pink from the warmth and scrubbing. Clean for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. Above them, the water continued its steady cascade, steam rising around them like morning mist over a mountain onsen back home. And in that steam, suspended between fear and wonder, the first cracks appeared in their understanding of their enemy. When the water finally shut off, the sudden silence felt almost oppressive. Prisoners stood dripping, rivulets running from their hair down their backs, pooling at their feet. They looked around uncertainly, unsure what came next. Had they passed some test? Would punishment now follow? Instead, American soldiers appeared with armfuls of white cotton, towels, not rags, not thin strips of fabric, but actual towels, thick, absorbent, each one large enough to wrap around a man's waist. They were folded in neat stacks, marked with laundry stamps, smelling faintly of detergent. The prisoners stared. One man, a farmer's son from Hokkaido who had served in the 17th Army, reached out slowly to touch the towel handed to him. His fingers traced over the fabric as though it were some rare artifact. The towel was softer than anything he'd felt in 3 years of military service. In Japanese barracks, soldiers had shared thin cloths that barely absorbed moisture. Often, men had simply air-dried, letting tropical heat evaporate water from their skin. But this was luxury. He pressed the towel to his face, inhaling the clean scent, feeling the cotton absorb water from his cheeks and forehead. Around him, others did the same, drying themselves with a care that bordered on reverence. They draped the towels over their shoulders, wrapped them around their waists, used them to carefully dry their hair. For the Americans conducting this operation, it was routine. Standard military hygiene protocol, nothing special. Soap, water, towels, the basics of keeping prisoners healthy and camps disease-free. They had done this 1,000 times, with 1,000 different groups of prisoners, their faces showing neither kindness nor cruelty, just efficiency. But for the Japanese, this moment carried weight that the guards could never have imagined. They gave us towels, one prisoner later wrote in a diary that would be preserved in Japan's National Archives. Clean towels that smelled like soap. I held mine and remembered my mother's house, the towels she would heat by the fire in winter. I had not thought of such things in years. To be given this by the enemy, I did not know what to think. As they dried themselves, shuffling slowly back toward the barracks area, an unmistakable murmur passed through their ranks. Not quite conversation, not quite silence, but a shared acknowledgement that something unexpected had occurred. They had been braced for cruelty. They had received comfort. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. Back in the barracks, the prisoners sat on wooden benches arranged in long rows, their issued uniforms clinging slightly to still damp skin. The building smelled different now, less of unwashed bodies, more of soap and steam. Outside, the tropical afternoon stretched on, humid and oppressive. But inside, an atmosphere of uneasy contemplation had settled over the men. No one spoke at first. They folded their towels. They touched their clean hair. They examined their hands, startled by how pale their skin looked without its coating of grime. The physical transformation was undeniable, but the psychological impact ran deeper, more troubling. A former artillery lieutenant, 28 years old but looking 40 after months of combat, finally broke the silence. "What do you think they're planning?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Others turned to look at him. In his voice was the doubt they all felt, the suspicion that kindness must mask some darker purpose. After all, they had been warned repeatedly, drilled constantly, told in no uncertain terms that Americans were barbarians who took pleasure in torturing prisoners. The propaganda had been relentless. Images of cruel captors, stories of starvation and abuse, lectures about how surrender meant a fate worse than death. Yet here they sat, cleaner than they'd been in years, given soap and towels as though such things were routine. "Maybe," someone whispered. "It's to keep us docile, to make us soft." "Or to humiliate us," another suggested, "to strip us naked and force us to wash like children." But these explanations felt hollow even as they were spoken. There were easier ways to humiliate prisoners, simpler methods of control. The showers seemed too organized, too systematic, to be mere psychological torture. Then a darker thought emerged, whispered by a sailor who had been captured at Rabaul. What if it's like what happened in Europe? The word sent a chill through the barracks. Gas chambers. The prisoners knew little of the specifics. Information about European theaters of war had been scarce and filtered through military propaganda, but rumors had circulated. Whispers about Germans and Jews, about showers that weren't really showers, about systematic killing disguised as hygiene. "The pipes," someone said quietly. "They could pump anything through those pipes." The fear spread like fire through dry grass. "We stood under them willingly," another voice added, tinged with horror at the realization. "We let them spray us with whatever that was." "It was just water," someone countered, but his voice lacked conviction. "How do you know?" came the sharp reply. "How do you know there wasn't something mixed in? Poison that takes time to work? Chemicals that will make us sick later? The barracks filled with agitated murmuring. Men who had briefly felt relief now felt foolish, exposed, vulnerable. Had they been tricked? Were they even now dying slowly from whatever had been in that water? The suspicion was compounded by a deeper confusion, a clash between what the prisoners had known of bathing and what they had just experienced. In Japan, bathing was sacred, not just functional, but spiritual. The practice of soaking in hot springs, onsen, went back centuries, tied to Shinto concepts of purification. Public bathhouses were community centers where neighbors gathered, where social bonds were strengthened and shared warmth. Even in ordinary homes, the evening bath was ritual, a transition from the day's labors to night's rest. But the war had stripped away those traditions. Military life had transformed bathing from ritual to impossibility. Soldiers learned to endure filth as a badge of honor. Officers spoke of Western weakness, of how American soldiers needed luxuries while Japanese warriors could thrive in any condition. Cleanliness became associated with softness, with femininity, with unmilitary behavior. A former schoolteacher, now a captured infantry private, tried to articulate the confusion he felt. "In my grandmother's house," he said to the men near him, "we bathed every evening. My father would heat the water, and we would take turns. It was peaceful. But in the army, we were taught that such things made men weak, that true soldiers didn't need comfort. And now the enemy," someone finished the thought, "forces comfort upon us." The paradox was maddening. The American showers were not like Japanese baths. There was no soaking, no quiet contemplation, no community. Instead, it was industrial, rows of men under rows of nozzles, water timed and controlled, soap distributed by guards. It felt mechanical, stripped of spirituality, reduced to pure function, and yet, it worked. The prisoners couldn't deny that their bodies felt better. Lice were gone, sores were cleaner. Skin that had burned with infection now felt cooler, healthier. The constant itching that had driven some men nearly mad had vanished. "Maybe," a quiet voice suggested. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about humiliation or culture. Maybe they just don't want us to be sick." The suggestion was met with skeptical silence. Disease prevention, humanitarian concern. These concepts didn't fit the narrative they'd been fed. Americans were supposed to be cruel, vengeful, brutal. Why would they care if prisoners were clean or dirty, healthy or sick? "Because," an older sergeant finally said, his voice carrying authority earned through years of service, "corpses don't work. Sick prisoners require medical attention. Dead prisoners create disposal problems. Maybe—" he paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe they're practical, not kind." It was a more comfortable explanation. Pragmatism they could understand. The Americans needed them healthy for labor, so they enforced hygiene. It wasn't compassion, it was efficiency. But even as the men nodded, accepting this rationalization, doubt lingered. Because there were degrees of efficiency, there were minimum standards and excessive ones. And hot water, thick towels, abundant soap, these felt like more than mere pragmatism demanded. The waiting game. Days passed. The prisoners waited for the other shoe to drop, for the hidden cruelty to reveal itself. They moved through camp routines warily, always watching, always expecting the trap to spring. But the showers continued. Every morning, or every evening, schedules varied by barracks. The guards lined them up, marched them to the shower hall, distributed soap and towels, turned on the water, waited for them to wash, provided cleaner clothing when their uniforms were laundered. The routine was maddeningly consistent. No one died from the soap. No one fell ill from the water. No gas poured from the pipes. The prisoners washed, dried, dressed, and returned to their barracks, alive and incrementally cleaner each time. Slowly, so slowly that many didn't notice it happening, the fear began to ebb. Not disappear entirely. The suspicion remained, a background radiation of doubt that colored every interaction with their captors. But the acute terror, the certainty that death lurked in those shower nozzles, gradually faded. In its place came something more complex, confusion tinged with reluctant curiosity. Why were the Americans doing this? The guards offered no explanations. They were not unkind, but neither were they communicative. They issued orders, enforced compliance, and moved on to their next duties with the mechanical efficiency of men following regulations. The interpreters, Japanese Americans whose very existence unsettled the prisoners, occasionally provided fragments of information. "It's Army procedure," one explained in formal Japanese when a prisoner worked up the courage to ask. "Hygiene standards required by military protocol." "But why?" the prisoner pressed. "Why does it matter?" The interpreter shrugged, his American mannerisms jarring. "Disease spreads. Sick prisoners can't work. And—" He paused, seemed to decide something, then continued. "And the American military believes in maintaining human dignity, even for prisoners of war. It's in the Geneva Convention." Geneva Convention. The prisoners had heard the term, vaguely, but knew almost nothing about it. International laws governing the treatment of prisoners of war were not topics Japanese soldiers had been educated about. Many had been told such agreements were Western inventions designed to weaken warrior spirit. But here was evidence that these conventions, whatever they entailed, apparently required the provision of showers, soap, and towels. The revelation was disorienting. One prisoner, writing secretly in a journal made from scraps of paper, captured the moment. "We are given more care in captivity than our own officers provided in service. The Americans feed us better than our military did on Guadalcanal. They heal our wounds. They make us wash. I do not understand this enemy. I do not understand how we were so wrong about them." By the third week of captivity, the march to the showers had become as familiar as morning roll call. The prisoners no longer clutched their soap with suspicious hands. They no longer flinched when the water started flowing. The routine had been repeated so many times that their bodies moved through it almost automatically. Strip, step under the stream, soap up, rinse, dry, dress. What had once been alien was now simply Tuesday. The American guards noticed the change. They no longer needed to bark orders as loudly or gesture as emphatically. The prisoners lined up with less resistance, moved through the process with greater efficiency. Some guards even relaxed slightly, their rigid postures easing as they supervised what had become a mundane daily task. But for the prisoners, the routine carried weight far beyond its apparent simplicity. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, a 32-year-old veteran of campaigns in China and the South Pacific, began to observe the showers with a more analytical eye. He noticed how the Americans measured soap distribution precisely, how they timed the water flow, how they inspected prisoners afterward for signs of lice or skin conditions, how they recorded health improvements in clipboards with graphs and numbers. "It's a system," he realized one evening, speaking quietly to a group of men in his barracks. "Everything the Americans do is a system. The showers aren't random kindness or hidden cruelty. They're part of a system designed to maintain prisoner health." "But why design such a system?" someone asked. Yamamoto thought carefully before responding. "Because they can. Because they have the resources, the water, the soap, the fuel to heat water, the organization to implement it across every camp. This isn't kindness. It's abundance." The observation rippled through conversations in the days that followed. Abundance. The word represented something fundamentally different from the scarcity that had defined Japanese military life. These men had fought in armies where ammunition was precious, food scarce, medicine almost non-existent. They had been taught that Japan's warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantages, that will and courage mattered more than supplies. But here, faced with endless hot water, the lie began to unravel. "If they can provide this for prisoners," a former naval officer mused, "what must they provide for their own soldiers?" The question opened a door to uncomfortable thoughts. If American prisoners of war received daily hot showers, what did American combat troops receive? If even captives got soap and towels, what luxuries awaited U.S. forces returning from battle? The contrast with their own experience was too stark to ignore. The daily routine also brought moments of confusion that broke the monotony of captivity. Language remained a constant challenge. Most prisoners spoke no English. Most guards spoke no Japanese. The interpreters were spread thin across the camp, unable to be everywhere at once. This led to misunderstandings that ranged from comedic to frustrating. One morning, a guard tried to explain to a group of prisoners that they needed to scrub their feet more thoroughly. He pointed at his own boots, then at the prisoners' bare feet, making exaggerated scrubbing motions. The prisoners, confused, thought he was complaining about their footwear and began apologizing for their worn-out shoes. The guard, growing more frustrated, pulled off his own boot and sock and began scrubbing his foot with soap under a running nozzle. The prisoners watched in bewildered silence, unsure whether this was some bizarre American custom or a particularly strange form of punishment. Finally, an interpreter arrived and clarified. Foot hygiene prevented fungal infections, a serious problem in tropical climates. The prisoners needed to wash between their toes daily. After that incident, foot washing became almost ritualistic. Men who had never given their feet much thought now scrubbed them with dedicated attention, comparing notes on technique, discussing the strange American obsession with preventing athletes' foot. These small interactions, awkward and fumbling, nonetheless created tiny bridges of understanding. The prisoners began to recognize individual guards by face and manner. Some guards were stricter, others more relaxed. Most were simply following orders, doing jobs that seemed to bore them as much as any other military duty. One guard, a young private from Nebraska, started saying "good morning" in badly pronounced Japanese every day. The prisoners, startled at first, eventually began responding in equally bad English. It wasn't friendship. The barbed wire and power dynamics made that impossible. But it was human interaction that transcended pure captor-captive relationships. And with each successful wash, with each day that passed without incident, the prisoner's sense of the showers transformed. What had begun as terror evolved into routine, and routine bred a strange kind of acceptance. They were still prisoners, they were still defeated, but at least they were clean. The effects of regular washing became impossible to ignore. Within 2 weeks, the chronic rashes that had plagued nearly every prisoner began to fade. Skin that had been angry and inflamed calmed to healthy pink. Tropical ulcers, once festering and painful, started to heal as regular cleaning prevented new infections. The lice disappeared entirely. For soldiers who had scratched at louse-infested scalps for months, the relief was profound. Some men ran their fingers through their hair repeatedly, marveling at the absence of vermin. Others examined their clothing seams, where lice eggs had once clustered, finding them empty. "I can sleep," one prisoner confessed to his bunkmate. "For the first time since New Guinea, I can sleep without waking to scratch." The medics took notes. American military doctors moved through the barracks regularly, conducting health inspections with clipboards and stethoscopes. They recorded infection rates, measured healing progress, tracked disease outbreaks. To them, the prisoners were data points in a larger system of camp management, but they were also human beings whose health was visibly improving. Dysentery cases dropped. The constant diarrhea that had tormented men eating spoiled rations and drinking contaminated water became less common as proper sanitation combined with cleaner bodies and regular medical attention. Respiratory infections decreased. The coughing that had echoed through barracks at night gradually subsided. Lungs cleared. Breathing became easier. The prisoners could feel the difference in their bodies. They woke with more energy. Their wounds healed faster. Even their mental states seemed to improve as the constant physical discomfort that had worn down their spirits lifted somewhat. A corporal who had served in the siege of Rabaul stood before a small mirror one morning, one of the few in the camp, and barely recognized himself. His face looked younger without the grime. His eyes, though still haunted by experiences he couldn't forget, showed less of the exhausted desperation that had defined the final months of combat. "I look human again," he thought, and the revelation carried both relief and shame. Relief that his body was healing. Shame that it took capture by the enemy to achieve what his own army had never provided. As the weeks stretched on, the comparison became inescapable. In the quiet of the barracks, when guards were distant and men could speak more freely, the conversations turned to memories of life in the Imperial Japanese Army. And those memories, viewed through the lens of their current experience, looked very different than they had during active service. On Guadalcanal, a former Marine sergeant recalled, we went 6 weeks without bathing. 6 weeks. Our uniforms rotted on our bodies. Men died from infections that started as small cuts. We had no soap, no clean water, nothing. Our officers told us it was honorable to endure. That suffering proved our warrior spirit. In Burma, another added, my unit shared 1 basin of water among 30 men. We splashed our faces and called it washing. Lice ate us alive. Our feet rotted. But we were told that this was what soldiers did, that Americans were weak because they needed comfort. A third prisoner, older and more contemplative, spoke slowly. In training camp near Osaka, I remember the public bath nearby. On leave, we could visit. But once deployed, that life ended. Everything became about endurance, denying the body's needs, proving we could survive what would kill softer men. The irony burned like acid. Here in captivity, forced to shower by enemy guards, they were healthier than they had ever been while serving the emperor. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. Everything they had been taught about strength through suffering, about Western weakness and Japanese superiority, crumbled under the simple reality of hot water and soap. Do you remember, someone said quietly, how they told us Americans couldn't fight in jungles because they needed too many supplies? How they were soft because they demanded regular meals and medical care. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. And now, the voice continued, we see they provide those same things even to us, their enemies, prisoners who fought against them. They feed us better than our own army did. They heal our wounds. They make us clean. What does that say about their strength? The question hung unanswered because the answer was too uncomfortable to speak aloud. It said that perhaps America's power didn't come from spiritual strength or warrior tradition. It came from industrial capacity, from systems and organization, from abundance so vast that it could extend even to enemies. It said that Japan had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. One prisoner, a former teacher drafted into service, tried to articulate what many were feeling. We were taught that comfort weakens men. That hardship builds character. But what if that was wrong? What if strength comes not from enduring suffering, but from eliminating it? What if an army that keeps its soldiers clean and healthy can fight better, longer, more effectively, than an army that prides itself on endurance? The implications were staggering. If true, it meant that Japanese military philosophy, the entire framework of bushidō, of warrior spirit, of honorable suffering, had been a crippling disadvantage. That while Japanese soldiers proved they could endure horrific conditions, American soldiers had been spared those conditions entirely and thus retained strength for actual combat. Look at us, the teacher continued. After just weeks of regular bathing and decent food, we feel stronger. Imagine if we had felt this way during the fighting. Imagine if our army had provided what these Americans provide routinely. The shame of defeat mixed with the shame of realization. They had not been beaten solely by superior firepower or numbers. They had been beaten by a civilization that understood something fundamental, that caring for soldiers' basic needs wasn't weakness. It was force multiplier. It was a Tuesday morning 6 weeks into captivity when the psychological breakthrough occurred. The prisoners had filed into the shower room as usual, their movements now automatic. They stripped, folded their uniforms, accepted their soap bars with barely a thought. The water came on with its familiar hiss. Steam rose. But this time, as Private Hiroshi Nakamura stepped under the stream, something shifted. He wasn't a young man, 33 years old, conscripted from a fishing village in Shikoku. He had fought at Tarawa, survived the nightmare of that battle only to be captured days later. For 6 weeks he had gone through the shower routine with mechanical compliance, neither resisting nor embracing it. Now, as hot water poured over his shoulders, he closed his eyes. And he remembered. He remembered his wife heating water in their small kitchen on winter evenings, the steam rising from the wooden tub, the careful ritual of bathing their son, then their daughter, before he would finally sink into the warmth himself. The way the heat would soak into muscles tired from hauling nets all day. The peace of it. The simple, profound humanity of being clean. Tears mixed with the shower water running down his face. He realized, with sudden clarity, that the Americans weren't trying to humiliate him. They weren't playing a long game of psychological torture. They weren't softening him for some later cruelty. They were simply maintaining basic human dignity. It wasn't kindness, not exactly. It was policy, procedure, regulation. But the effect was the same. In treating prisoners as human beings who needed to be clean, the Americans were extending a form of respect that transcended the brutality of war. Nakamura scrubbed his arms slowly, methodically, feeling the soap foam and rinse away. He washed his hair, worked the lather through to his scalp, remembered teaching his son how to do the same. He cleaned his feet, his hands, his face, and for the first time since capture, he didn't feel like a defeated enemy or a dishonored soldier. He felt like a man, a husband, a father who wanted to survive this war and go home to the family he'd left behind. Around him, other prisoners were having similar epiphanies. The suspicion that had defined the first weeks of captivity was dissolving. Not all at once. Some men still clung to distrust. But gradually, like dirt washing down a drain, the fear and paranoia were being replaced by pragmatic acceptance. This was real. The showers were simply showers. The soap was simply soap. The Americans weren't monsters or saints. They were victors enforcing their standards on the defeated, and those standards happened to include basic hygiene. As the prisoners filed out of the shower hall that day, toweling off and returning to their barracks, the conversations had changed. "My shoulders feel better," someone commented. "That old injury from Bougainville, the warm water helps." "I haven't had a headache in days," another added. "Used to have them constantly from the lice." "Sleep is easier when you're not scratching all night," a third agreed. These were small things, mundane observations. But they represented a seismic shift in perspective. The prisoners were no longer asking why the Americans made them wash. They were accepting it as part of camp life, even acknowledging, quietly, almost reluctantly, that they benefited from it. Of course, the American guards had their own view of the situation, and it was considerably less philosophical. Corporal James "Jimmy" Patterson from Des Moines had been assigned to POW duty after recovering from wounds received on Saipan. He found the work boring but preferable to combat. His job was straightforward: maintain order, enforce hygiene protocols, prevent escape attempts, ensure prisoners stayed healthy enough to perform work details. "They were scared shitless at first," he remarked to a fellow guard one evening, smoking a cigarette outside the barracks. "Thought we were going to kill them. Now they line up like it's no big deal." "Health inspector came through yesterday," his companion replied. "Said infection rates are down 70% compared to when they arrived. Makes our job easier." That was the American perspective distilled. Hygiene was practical. Keep the prisoners clean, and you reduce disease. Reduce disease, and you reduced workload for medics. Reduce problems, and the camp ran smoother. It was efficiency, not compassion, though the effect might look similar. The guards had been briefed on Geneva Convention requirements, though most understood only the basics. Don't torture. Provide adequate food and shelter. Maintain sanitary conditions. Allow religious observance. Ensure medical care. The regulations were clear, the procedures established. What many guards didn't realize was how profoundly different this treatment was from what Japanese prisoners had expected. They saw reluctant compliance and assumed it was normal prisoner behavior. They didn't understand the cultural context, the bushidō codes, the propaganda about American brutality, the expectation of death rather than decent treatment. One sergeant, a career soldier who had overseen POW camps in North Africa before being transferred to the Pacific, had more insight. "These Japanese boys," he told a new replacement guard, "they're different from the Germans or Italians I dealt with. Those guys expected decent treatment. Hell, some German prisoners were almost indignant if their accommodations weren't up to standard. But these Japanese? They expected to die. Everything we do that doesn't kill them is a shock to their system." "So, the showers," the new guard began. "The showers, the food, the medical care, it's all the same to them. Proof that we're not the monsters they were told about. It's psychological warfare without even trying. We're just following regulations. But to them, It's revolutionary. The sergeant was closer to the truth than he knew. As summer gave way to autumn, the conversations in the barracks had evolved considerably. The prisoners no longer discussed whether the Americans would kill them or how the showers might be instruments of torture. Instead, they talked about what the showers represented, what they revealed about American civilization, about the nature of the enemy they had fought. Sergeant Yamamoto, the analytical observer, had become an unofficial philosopher for his barracks. Men gathered around him in the evenings to hear his thoughts. "Consider," he said one night, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet space, "what it takes to provide daily hot showers for thousands of prisoners across dozens of camps." The men listened. "First, you need infrastructure: plumbing, pipes, water heaters. The Americans built this entire facility, including these shower rooms, before prisoners even arrived. That requires planning, resources, construction capability." He warmed to his subject. "Second, you need constant supplies: soap, towels, detergent for laundry. These must be manufactured, transported, distributed. The logistics alone are staggering, yet it happens daily, without fail." Men nodded slowly, beginning to see his point. "Third, you need fuel to heat the water: coal or oil burned in boilers every single day. The Americans have so much fuel they can spare it to warm water for enemy prisoners. Think about that. In our army, fuel was precious. Ships risked everything to bring oil to our forces, but here they burn it so we can bathe in comfort." The implications settled over them like a weight. "And fourth," Yamamoto concluded, "you need a system that values hygiene enough to enforce it as policy. Not as kindness to individual prisoners, but as standard operating procedure across all camps. That means organization at a national level. Regulations written, distributed, implemented, monitored." A long silence followed. Finally, someone spoke. "We were told America was weak, that they were soft, dependent on luxuries. But if they can provide luxury even to prisoners, then they're not weak," Yamamoto finished. "They're incredibly strong. So strong they can afford to be, by our standards, wasteful. So organized that efficiency itself becomes a form of power." The conversation shifted to comparisons with Japan. "I visited a military hospital in Osaka before deployment," a former medic recalled. "The supplies were limited. We rationed everything. Bandages were reused until they fell apart. Medicine was scarce, and that was for our wounded, not prisoners." "My brother worked in a munitions factory," another added. "He told me workers had to provide their own soap if they wanted to wash after shifts. The factory provided none." "And here," someone said quietly, "the enemy provides soap even for us." The observations piled up, each one a small brick in a wall of realization they were collectively building. A wall that separated their old understanding from a new, uncomfortable truth. Japan had fought a war of spirit against a war of systems, courage against capacity, will against wealth, and systems had won. The showers also stirred memories that many prisoners had tried to suppress. In the communal washing, in the steam and warmth, they couldn't help but remember Japanese bathing culture. The public bathhouses where communities gathered, the sento with its tiled rooms and deep tubs, the onsen in mountain villages, natural hot springs where families would travel for relaxation. "My grandfather," one prisoner said wistfully, "used to take me to an onsen near Mount Fuji. The water came from deep underground, heated by volcanic rock. We would sit together watching snow fall outside while we soaked in perfect warmth." "In my neighborhood," another remembered, "the bathhouse was where everyone went in the evening. You would see your neighbors, catch up on news, relax after work. It was the center of social life." These memories were bittersweet. The American showers weren't like Japanese baths. There was no soaking, no quiet contemplation, no social bonding. They were industrial, functional, designed for efficiency rather than enjoyment. Yet they still evoked those earlier memories, reminding the prisoners of a life that felt impossibly distant. "Do you think," someone asked hesitantly, "that Japan still has public baths?" After the bombings, the destruction, no one answered. The question was too painful. They knew the war had devastated Japanese cities, that American bombers had reduced vast urban areas to ash. Whether the bathhouses survived, whether their families survived, whether anything of the world they remembered still existed, these were questions without answers, gnawing uncertainties that haunted their captivity. But the showers at least gave them a connection to that past, a thread linking them to who they had been before the war. Washing became a form of meditation, a space where they could remember being civilians, being fathers and sons, being men with lives beyond combat. One prisoner began a daily ritual. While showering, he would recite the names of his family members silently. His wife Yuki, his daughter Akiko, his son Taro, his parents, his siblings. Saying their names, remembering their faces, became a way to keep those connections alive. A way to remind himself that he was more than a prisoner, more than a soldier, more than a number in an American camp. Others adopted similar practices. Some prayed. Some sang old songs quietly, barely audible over the water. Some simply stood still, letting the warmth wash over them, and thought of home. The guards never understood these moments. To them, the prisoners were simply washing, following orders, maintaining hygiene. They didn't see the spiritual dimension, the way these men were using the showers as space for private grief and hope and remembrance. In that gap of understanding lay a profound irony. The Americans provided the showers as a practical matter of camp management. But for the Japanese prisoners, they had become something much more, a daily ritual that kept them connected to their humanity and their past. By the 4th month of captivity, an undeniable truth had taken root in the prisoners' collective consciousness. They were healthier now than they had been while serving in the Imperial Japanese Army. It wasn't just the absence of lice or the healing of tropical ulcers. It was comprehensive. They received 3 meals daily, not gourmet, but adequate. They slept on cots with blankets. They had access to medical care. They showered regularly. They weren't being shot at or bombed. They weren't starving or dying of preventable diseases. One prisoner, keeping a secret journal on scraps of paper hidden in his mattress, wrote, "We are prisoners of war, yet we live better than we did as soldiers. We eat better than we did at the front. We are cleaner than we ever were in barracks. This is the shameful truth we whisper but cannot deny." The paradox gnawed at their sense of identity. In Japanese military philosophy, hardship was honorable. Soldiers were expected to endure, to sacrifice, to suffer without complaint. The ability to withstand misery was proof of superior spirit. But here, their enemies maintained standards that Japanese military doctrine would have labeled as excessive, even weakening. And those standards were making them stronger. A former army captain, educated at military academy in Tokyo, struggled with this realization more than most. He had been taught that Western focus on individual comfort was a civilizational flaw, a sign of decadence that would ultimately prove fatal. Japanese troops, he had learned, were superior precisely because they could fight under conditions that would break Western soldiers. But now he saw the flaw in that logic. "If we can fight better when healthy and clean," he confided to a small group he trusted, "then denying us those things wasn't strength. It was stupidity masked as tradition." The words felt like treason. He had spent years believing in the system, had sent men to die believing in bushidō principles. To admit it had been wrong, or at least incomplete, shook the foundation of his identity. Yet the evidence was undeniable. He had watched men in his former unit die from infections that would have been treatable with basic hygiene. He had seen soldiers reduced to ineffectiveness by disease and malnutrition when they should have been combat-ready. He had experienced the grinding exhaustion of fighting while physically depleted, and now understood how much stronger he could have been with simple interventions like regular bathing. "The Americans," he said slowly, "don't see soldier care as weakness. They see it as force multiplication. A healthy soldier fights better, longer, more effectively. Everything we thought was making us strong was actually making us weak." As prisoners swapped stories of their service, the contrast with American treatment became impossible to ignore. A naval rating described being aboard a destroyer for 8 months with no bathing facilities. We wiped ourselves with rags soaked in seawater. Salt crusted on our skin. Men developed sores that never healed. Our uniforms rotted, but we were told this was normal, that sailors must endure. An infantry soldier recalled trudging through Burmese jungles for weeks, his uniform literally disintegrating from sweat and humidity. My boots fell apart. My feet were masses of blisters and infections. We had no medicine, no bandages, no soap. Officers said we must push through. That pain was temporary, but honor, eternal. A veteran of the China campaigns spoke of going an entire winter without bathing. In Manchuria, it was too cold to wash. We wore the same underclothes for months. The smell was unbearable, but we got used to it. Lice were everywhere. Some men developed typhus. We buried them and kept marching. Story after story painted the same picture. Systematic neglect of basic human needs, reframed as honorable suffering. And now, in captivity, they experienced the opposite. Their captors, whom they had been taught to despise, maintained standards that prioritized health, sanitation, and basic comfort. Why didn't our officers understand this? Someone asked, the question heavy with accusation. Why were we sent to fight half-starved, disease-ridden, unwashed? Was it truly honor, or was it just neglect? No one had good answers. Some defended the Japanese system, arguing that limited resources forced difficult choices. Better to allocate scarce supplies to weapons and ammunition than to soap and medicine. In a war of survival, such calculations were necessary. But others weren't convinced. Resources were limited, yes, a former logistics officer acknowledged. But priorities were wrong. We built giant battleships that sank after single battles. We developed human torpedoes. We planned suicide attacks. But we couldn't provide soap. We couldn't organize field sanitation. These aren't resource problems. These are philosophical problems. The conversation was dangerous, potentially treasonous. Even in captivity, old loyalties and fears persisted. Criticism of Japanese leadership, of military policy, of national strategy. These were lines most prisoners feared to cross, but the reality was too stark to ignore. The Americans feed us better than Japanese soldiers ate at the front, someone stated flatly. That's not a matter of resources. That's a matter of how each nation values its people. A heavy silence followed that observation. Because if true, it meant that Japan had sent millions of men to fight in a system that fundamentally undervalued them, that the propaganda about honorable suffering had been a mask for systematic negligence, that soldiers had died not because sacrifice was necessary, but because their leaders had failed to grasp basic principles of military effectiveness. These were thoughts that felt disloyal to speak, yet grew harder to suppress with each passing day of clean water and healing wounds. 6 months into captivity, the showers had become more than routine. They had become a measuring stick by which the prisoners evaluated everything they had been taught. For many, the psychological transformation was profound. Private Kenji Sato, who had been captured on Saipan, found himself analyzing every aspect of camp life through a new lens. The showers were just the beginning. He noticed that Americans maintained strict schedules, meals at precise times, roll calls at designated hours, work details organized with clear objectives. There was order, but not the chaotic order of Japanese military life where brutal discipline coexisted with logistical chaos. They plan, he observed to his bunkmates. Everything is planned, not just what to do, but how to do it efficiently. The showers are part of that. They calculated how much soap is needed per prisoner per week, how much water, how long each session should last. Everything is measured, organized, systematized. This realization extended beyond hygiene. The food, while not luxurious, came in predictable quantities. Prisoners knew what to expect at each meal. Rations didn't mysteriously disappear due to corruption or incompetence the way they had in Japanese supply lines. Medical care followed protocols. Wounds were treated according to established procedures, not the whims of individual officers. Even recreation was organized. The Americans established a library with books and magazines. They allowed prisoners to form baseball teams, to garden, to create rudimentary entertainment. These weren't acts of kindness so much as calculated morale management, but they demonstrated a level of systematic thinking about prisoner welfare that astonished men used to Japanese military indifference. "In our army," Sato said, "soldiers were told to endure without complaint. Problems were met with orders to have stronger spirit. But here, Americans solve problems with systems. If prisoners get sick, they improve sanitation. If morale drops, they provide recreation. They don't demand we overcome through willpower. They change conditions." This approach represented a fundamentally different philosophy. Japanese military culture, rooted in samurai traditions, emphasized the primacy of spirit over material conditions. A warrior with sufficient determination could overcome any obstacle. Pain, hunger, disease, these were tests of character to be conquered through willpower. American military culture, rooted in industrial pragmatism, emphasized the opposite. Solve the material problems and spirit will follow. A well-fed, healthy, clean soldier with good equipment doesn't need to waste energy on endurance. He can focus that energy on fighting. The prisoners were living proof of which approach worked better. As understanding grew, so did an emotion many prisoners found uncomfortable: respect for their captors. Not affection, not friendship. The guards were still guards, enforcing rules within a prison system. But professional respect for an enemy who had proven more capable than propaganda had suggested. "They beat us," an infantry sergeant admitted one evening, "not just in battle, but in this. In organization, in efficiency, in understanding that winning wars requires more than brave soldiers." Others nodded slowly. "We were taught they were soft," a corporal added, "that they couldn't endure hardship. But they don't endure hardship, they eliminate it. And that makes them harder to beat, not easier." The distinction was crucial. Japanese soldiers had proven they could fight under horrific conditions, but American soldiers fought under better conditions, which allowed them to be more effective. It wasn't that Americans lacked toughness. They had proven capable of brutal combat when necessary. It was that they didn't fetishize suffering the way Japanese military culture did. This realization extended to the showers specifically. "Every day we shower," someone noted, "and every day we're a little bit healthier, a little bit stronger. If American troops do this too, and surely they do with better facilities than ours, then they maintain combat effectiveness that our troops lose to disease and exhaustion." It was a military insight masquerading as an observation about hygiene. In the grinding attritional warfare of the Pacific, where both sides fought under tropical conditions that bred disease and misery, the side that maintained troop health had an enormous advantage. Japanese units often lost more men to illness than combat. American units, with better sanitation, medicine, and, yes, hygiene standards, retained far more of their strength. The showers weren't just about cleanliness. They were about preserving combat power, and the prisoners, through their own experience, had learned this lesson the hard way. Some resisted these conclusions, clinging to traditional beliefs. They argued that such thinking dishonored those who had died, that accepting American methods as superior betrayed Japanese values, that even in defeat maintaining pride in their own traditions mattered. But these voices grew quieter as evidence accumulated. Because the truth, simple, undeniable, was that regular hot showers represented a level of organizational sophistication and resource abundance that Japan had never matched. And that gap, multiplied across every aspect of military logistics, explained more about defeat than any number of brave last stands or tales of warrior spirit. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the prisoners understood they were witnessing the death throes of Imperial Japan. News filtered into the camp slowly, heavily censored, but impossible to entirely suppress. The Philippines lost. Iwo Jima fallen. Okinawa becoming a graveyard for a Japanese garrison that fought to annihilation. American bombers reducing Japanese cities to ash. The prisoners knew their homeland was dying, and they were powerless to stop it. In this context, the daily shower routine took on even deeper meaning. It was continuity in a world collapsing. It was order imposed on chaos. It was proof that somewhere systems still functioned, that civilization persisted even as war consumed everything. Some prisoners clung to the showers as a form of meditation. The hot water became a space for processing grief and guilt. Grief for what was happening to their country. Guilt for surviving while their comrades died. Others found in the routine a strange kind of hope. If they could emerge from captivity healthy and clean, if they could maintain dignity through defeat, perhaps there was a future worth surviving toward. Perhaps Japan itself could emerge from devastation and rebuild. "We are learning," one prisoner said quietly, "how a modern nation functions, how systems create strength. When we return, if we return, we will carry this knowledge home." It was a subversive thought. The idea that Japan could learn from its conquerors, that defeat could be educational rather than merely shameful. But as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, more prisoners began thinking along these lines. They discussed carefully and quietly what post-war Japan might look like, how the country might need to change, what lessons could be taken from this experience of captivity. And always their conversations came back to the showers, to the simple realization that caring for people's basic needs, food, health, cleanliness, wasn't weakness, but wisdom. That a strong nation didn't demand its people suffer unnecessarily. That abundance properly organized was more powerful than sacrifice poorly managed. These were dangerous ideas in Imperial Japan. But Imperial Japan was dying, and the prisoners knew it. When news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached the camp, followed days later by announcement of surrender, the prisoners reacted with a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the killing would stop, shame that Japan had been defeated, horror at the descriptions of atomic devastation, uncertainty about what surrender meant for them and their families. In the immediate aftermath, the shower routine continued unchanged. Americans still enforced the same hygiene standards, still distributed soap and towels, still maintained the daily schedule. In the chaos of war's end, this continuity was almost comforting. But now, washing carried new significance. The prisoners understood they would eventually go home. Not immediately. Repatriation would take months. But eventually, they would return to whatever remained of Japan. They would see their families, assuming their families had survived. They would rejoin a nation that had been utterly defeated, bombed into submission, forced to accept unconditional surrender. What would they tell their children about this experience? How would they explain that their enemy had treated them with more consistent care than their own military had? That they had been healthier, cleaner, better fed in captivity than in service? These were questions without easy answers. Some resolved to never speak of it, to keep the paradox private. Others felt an obligation to share what they had learned, to help rebuild Japan using lessons learned from defeat. But all of them recognized that the showers, those strange, initially terrifying daily rituals, had fundamentally changed how they understood power, civilization, and what it meant to be strong. "We thought strength meant endurance," one prisoner reflected. "We were wrong. Strength means not needing to endure unnecessarily. Strength means building systems that make life better, not just bearable." The journey home began in late 1945 and stretched into 1946. Prisoners were processed, documented, given basic supplies, and loaded onto transport ships for the voyage back to Japan. As they left the camps that had held them, many looked back at the shower facilities with complicated emotions. Those buildings, once sources of fear and suspicion, had become familiar landmarks. The routine of daily washing had been woven into the fabric of their captivity. Leaving meant abandoning not just imprisonment, but also the strange security of enforced order. The voyage home was somber. Men stood on deck watching the Pacific slip past, wondering what they would find upon arrival. Most had received no word from families during their captivity. They didn't know who had survived the war, what had become of their homes, whether anything they remembered still existed. But they were clean. The Americans had required them to shower before departure, had issued them basic clean clothing for the journey. Even in this final act, hygiene standards were maintained. When they finally arrived in Japan, the devastation shocked even those who had been warned. Cities reduced to ash and rubble, populations gaunt from starvation, infrastructure destroyed. The proud nation that had embarked on conquest across Asia now lay broken, occupied by the same American forces that had maintained their prison camps. The returning prisoners were received with ambivalence. Some communities welcomed them back, grateful for any survivors. Others viewed them with suspicion or shame, soldiers who had allowed themselves to be captured rather than dying honorably. The stigma of survival, of choosing life over death, marked many former POWs for years. Few spoke openly about their experiences in captivity. The good treatment they had received didn't fit the narrative most Japanese wanted to tell about the war. It was easier to focus on the heroism of those who had died than to grapple with the complicated reality of those who had lived. But in private, in quiet conversations with family members or fellow veterans, the story of the showers sometimes emerged. "The Americans made us bathe every day," a former prisoner told his teenage son years later. "At first we thought it was torture. We didn't understand. But they were teaching us something we had forgotten, that cleanliness is strength, that caring for yourself isn't weakness." His son listened, trying to understand a world he had never known. "When you wash," the father continued, "remember what it means. Remember that a civilized people doesn't glorify suffering, they reduce it. They build systems that make life better. This is something Japan must learn if we are to become strong again." It was a lesson passed down quietly, one family at a time. Decades later, historians studying Japanese POWs in American custody would find the shower incident emblematic of larger cultural clashes. Dr. Akira Tanaka, a military historian at Tokyo University, wrote in 1978, "The daily hygiene routines enforced in American POW camps represented a fundamental philosophical divide between American and Japanese military cultures. For Japanese soldiers raised in bushidō tradition, the concern with bodily comfort seemed almost shameful, but this American focus on systematic health maintenance proved militarily superior, contributing to better force sustainability throughout the Pacific Campaign." American records confirm the impact. Disease rates in American-held POW camps dropped dramatically after hygiene protocols were fully implemented. Deaths from preventable illnesses declined. The POWs, despite being held in tropical climates conducive to disease, generally remained healthier than Japanese soldiers in active service. The cost analysis was revealing. The soap, fuel for hot water, and laundering services provided to prisoners represented a tiny fraction of overall military expenditure. But the return on investment, reduced medical costs, more productive work details, fewer disease outbreaks that could potentially spread to guards, made economic sense. More than that, it aligned with American values about human dignity that, even in war, weren't entirely abandoned. The Geneva Conventions required certain minimum standards, but American camps generally exceeded those minimums. Not out of charity, but because the military culture valued systemic efficiency. Keep prisoners healthy, and problems reduce. It was pragmatism elevated to policy. For Japanese soldiers experiencing this system firsthand, the philosophical implications were profound. They were confronting direct evidence that their nation's approach to military organization had been fundamentally flawed. That warrior spirit, however admirable, couldn't compensate for logistical inadequacy. That suffering for its own sake was waste, not virtue. Some prisoners took these lessons to heart after returning home. They became advocates for modernization, for learning from America, for abandoning romantic notions of samurai tradition in favor of practical efficiency. Their influence, while difficult to measure directly, contributed to Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. Others rejected the implications, clinging to traditional values, insisting that Japan's defeat was circumstantial rather than philosophical. That with more resources, more time, different circumstances, Japanese methods would have prevailed. But even these skeptics couldn't entirely forget the showers. The memory lingered, an uncomfortable reminder that the enemy had proven capable of something Japan's military had not: systematic care for the basic needs of even the lowest priority individuals. In the decades following World War II, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse, the lessons learned by former POWs had subtle but real influence. The emphasis on hygiene, on systematic organization, on using resources efficiently to improve quality of life. These weren't uniquely American innovations. Japan had its own traditions of cleanliness and order. But the war had shown how these values could be systematically applied to large organizations, not just individual households. Some former prisoners entered positions of influence in post-war Japan. They brought with them memories of how Americans organized everything, including something as simple as daily bathing. They advocated for similar systematic approaches in Japanese industry, government, education. "We should learn from those who defeated us," one former POW, now a bureaucrat in MITI, argued in internal meetings. Not to copy blindly, but to understand their methods and adapt them to Japanese contexts. It wasn't always a popular position. Pride and nationalism made many Japanese resistant to learning from their conquerors. But pragmatism eventually won out. Japan couldn't afford to ignore what worked simply because the source was American. The result was a fascinating synthesis: Japanese values and aesthetics combined with American-inspired systematic organization. The outcome helped drive the Japanese miracle of post-war economic growth. Of course, attributing this transformation to POW experiences with showers would be absurd oversimplification. Countless factors drove Japan's post-war success. But the showers represented something real. A moment when ordinary soldiers confronted evidence that their understanding of strength and civilization had been incomplete. Some former prisoners remained haunted by the paradox until their deaths. Hiroshi Nakamura, the fisherman from Shikoku, returned home to find his village largely intact but his family struggling with poverty. He rebuilt his life slowly, fishing the same waters his father had worked. But he never forgot the showers. "I learned something in captivity," he told his grandchildren in the 1980s when he was an old man with more memories than future. "I learned that the Americans were not monsters. They were just people with better organization. And that scared me more than if they had been monsters, because it meant we lost to something we could have learned ourselves." Captain Yamamoto, the analytical sergeant who had philosophized about the shower's meaning, returned to education after the war. He became a teacher, then a principal, then an educational reformer. He advocated for better school facilities, including, notably, improved hygiene standards in Japanese schools. "Children cannot learn if they are uncomfortable," he argued in speeches and articles. "We must provide clean facilities, adequate sanitation, comfortable conditions. This isn't coddling students. This is maximizing their capacity to absorb knowledge." His advocacy helped modernize school hygiene standards across Japan. And though he rarely mentioned it publicly, the inspiration came from his time as a POW, watching Americans systematically maintain health through simple daily routines. Others carried different lessons. Some became pacifists, convinced that war brought only suffering regardless of who won or how prisoners were treated. Some became nationalists, determined that Japan would never again be in position to suffer such defeat. Some simply tried to forget, to move past wartime trauma and build normal lives. But for nearly all of them, the memory of those first showers remained vivid. The terror, the confusion, the gradual realization, the uncomfortable truths about strength and civilization. In the end, what made the shower experience so transformative wasn't complexity, but simplicity. The Americans didn't employ sophisticated psychological tactics. They didn't craft elaborate programs of re-education. They simply enforced basic hygiene standards that they would have maintained for their own troops, extended now to prisoners under their control. The power came from consistency. Every day, the same routine. Every day, hot water and soap. Every day, proof that this wasn't a trick or temporary condition, but simply how Americans organize things. The repetition, the reliability, the systematic nature of it all. This communicated more effectively than any propaganda could have. It showed that America's strength wasn't just material but organizational, that they had built systems capable of functioning across vast distances, maintaining standards even for the lowest priority individuals. That their power rested not on individual heroism, though they had heroes too, but on infrastructure, logistics, planning, and execution. For Japanese soldiers trained to believe that spirit transcended material conditions, this was revelation and indictment simultaneously. Revelation because it showed them a different path to strength. Indictment because it highlighted failures in their own military culture. The showers were a metaphor made physical. They represented abundance, organization, and a fundamentally different understanding of what made nations powerful. And because the prisoners lived that metaphor daily for months or years, its lessons sank deep. Some lessons are learned in classrooms or through study, but the deepest lessons, the ones that change how people see the world, are often learned through lived experience, through body and repetition, through daily ritual that becomes part of how you understand reality. The showers provided that kind of education. They taught not through words, but through sensation, through the feeling of hot water on skin too long filthy, through the smell of soap and the texture of clean towels, through the gradual healing of wounds and the relief from constant discomfort. And those lessons, learned in the body, were harder to dismiss or ignore than any intellectual argument could have been. In 2003, a Japanese documentary crew visited former POW campsites in the United States, many now converted to other uses or simply abandoned. At one location in Louisiana, they found remnants of the shower facilities, rusting pipes, crumbling concrete, drains that no longer drained. The buildings were mostly gone, reclaimed by vegetation, but the infrastructure remained visible to those who knew what to look for. The crew interviewed 2 surviving former prisoners, both now in their 80s, who had agreed to participate in the documentary. Standing near the ruins, one old man ran his hand along a pipe. "This is where I first understood," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Where I first realized that everything I had been taught was incomplete. We thought strength meant endurance, but they showed us that strength meant not needing to endure unnecessarily." The other veteran nodded. "I was terrified that first day. We all were. We thought we were being led to execution. Instead," he paused, emotion tightening his voice. "Instead, they made us clean. They gave us dignity we didn't expect. It changed everything." The documentary aired in Japan to significant viewership. It sparked discussions online and in newspapers about the nature of that wartime experience, about what former prisoners had learned, about whether contemporary Japan remembered these lessons or had forgotten them in prosperity. Some viewers were defensive, arguing that focusing on decent treatment of POWs minimized Japanese suffering during the war. Others saw it as important history, a reminder of how defeat had taught humility and sparked transformation. But for those who had lived it, the shower facilities, ruined and overgrown as they now were, remained sacred in memory. They were the places where scared, defeated men had confronted unexpected humanity from their enemies, where the simplest of acts, washing with hot water and soap, had become a philosophical education, where the paradox of captivity had revealed truths about power, civilization, and what it truly means to be strong. In the end, that was the lasting legacy. Not just that American POW camps maintained hygiene standards, but that those standards, enforced daily, taught a generation of Japanese soldiers that their understanding of strength had been fundamentally incomplete, that caring for basic human needs wasn't weakness disguised as strength, but actually the foundation of sustainable power. The showers were never meant to be profound. They were meant to be practical, keep prisoners healthy, reduce disease, maintain order. But in their very practicality, in their systematic reliability, in their simple effectiveness, they became something more. They became a quiet weapon that changed minds more effectively than propaganda ever could. A daily reminder that the enemy wasn't the monster propaganda had painted, but something potentially more unsettling. A civilization that had figured out how to organize abundance so thoroughly that even prisoners of war benefited from it. And that lesson, learned one hot shower at a time, helped reshape how an entire generation of Japanese men understood their own country, their former enemy, and the world they would rebuild after devastating defeat. The water kept flowing day after day, washing away more than just dirt. It washed away certainties, and in their place, it left uncomfortable truths that some would spend lifetimes trying to process. There's a photograph from 1945 taken at a POW camp in California just before repatriation began. It shows a group of Japanese prisoners lined up outside a shower facility waiting their turn. Their postures are relaxed now, familiar with routine. Some are talking quietly to each other. One appears to be laughing at something his neighbor said. They don't look like defeated enemies or terrified captives. They look like men performing a mundane daily task, no more remarkable than any other aspect of their incarceration. But if you look closely at their faces, you can see something else. A weariness that goes beyond physical exhaustion. The expression of people who have learned difficult truths and don't know quite what to do with that knowledge. These were men caught between worlds. Too much had changed to return to the Japan they had left. They had seen too much, learned too much, experienced too much to pretend nothing had shifted. The showers, those simple, practical, systematically enforced daily rituals, had done what bombs and bullets could not. They had changed how these men understood power, strength, and civilization itself. And as they stood in line, waiting to wash one final time before the long journey home, they carried with them lessons that would shape the rest of their lives and, in small but real ways, help shape the Japan that would rise from the ashes of defeat. Democracy made steel, the Americans might have said. But for these Japanese prisoners, democracy was made of something simpler and more profound. It was made of hot water, soap, and the systematic recognition that even enemies were human beings who deserved basic dignity. That was the revelation. That was the quiet weapon. That was the truth they couldn't forget no matter how hard they tried. And in the end, perhaps that was the most effective victory of all. Not defeating an enemy, but teaching them through the simplest of means that they had misunderstood the very nature of strength itself. The water kept flowing. The lessons kept teaching. And the men kept remembering, for the rest of their lives, the day they first stepped under those pipes and felt the warmth wash away more than just the dirt of battle. They felt it wash away certainty, and in its place leave a complicated, uncomfortable, ultimately transformative truth, that their enemy, in the very act of capturing them, had given them something their own army never could, the systematic care that comes not from kindness, but from abundance, not from compassion, but from organization, not from softness, but from a completely different understanding of what makes a civilization truly powerful. And they would carry that truth home into a broken Japan that desperately needed to learn the same lessons. The showers had served their purpose. The prisoners had been cleaned, yes, but more than that, they had been taught. And sometimes, the most powerful teaching comes not from words or lectures or propaganda. Sometimes it comes from nothing more profound than hot water, soap, and the daily repetition of simple human dignity.